This is the first event in the framework of the exhibition Textile Transfers, which deals with the work of Rosalia Roth-Hansel and Mileva Stoisalevich-Rolla, two women artists who were trained and who also taught at the former School of Arts and Crafts Vienna. So we are very happy that today we can host the book presentation of Julia Secklehner's new book, Rethinking Modern Austrian Art Beyond the Metropolis, which was published this year. Our exhibition, which Eva will now go through, because normally we host our events in the exhibition space, but this time it's not possible. That's why we show some pictures. So our exhibition explores different historical threads woven into the textile collections of these artists. One of our main questions is the function that the figures of the peasant and the rural took on in cultural, economical discourses and in artistic practices in the late Habsburg monarchy. Julia's book is linked to this perspective as it sheds light on the embeddedness of both figures in the cultural politics and popular visual culture after the First World War, during a period in which Austria not only became a new post-imperialist nation-state, but also a state with a much smaller territory and an uncertain and contested democratic future. So we are very thrilled to have you here and very excited that you give us a short outline also of your book later on. But first, let me briefly give the mic to Eva, who will introduce you.
Okay. Dr. Julia Secklehner is an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellow at Constructor University in Bremen since 2024, where she researches networks of modernist women photographers in Central Europe. She's otherwise based at Masaryk University in Brno, working as a postdoctoral researcher on the project Beyond the Village, Folk Cultures as Agents of Modernity, 1918 till 1945, which is funded by the Czech National Grant Agency. Julia completed her PhD in art history at the Kultur Institute of Art in 2018, and her monograph, Rethinking Modern Austrian Art Beyond the Metropolis, published by Routledge in 2025, received the Masaryk University Scientist Award in 2024. She already contributed a chapter to a publication that we made in cooperation with the program Expanded Museum Studies here at Angewandte. And we are fortunate to have her write a piece for our forthcoming book on textile transfers at the Kunstgewerbeschule. I'm looking forward to your presentation, and without further ado...
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eva, for the very kind introduction. And also thank you, Steffi. Thank you for inviting me. I'm suitably nervous because this is my first ever book presentation, actually. But before we get to a kind of chat, I thought I would just give you an overview of the book and its main arguments. And one thing that I should say before is that the book was part of a bigger project that was founded by the European Research Council, and both Marta Filipova and Matthew Rampley, who will also be talking in a few weeks' time, respectively, they were also part of the project. So in a way, it's really lovely to have this framework and to have us as part of the exhibition as well, because we work together very closely, and actually our research informed each other quite a lot. But having said this, I'm just going to do a quick introduction to Rethinking Modern Austrian Art Beyond the Metropolis. And I'm starting off with a quote. I put in some quotes. This is actually about American rural modernism, but it sort of encapsulated very well my main questions when I started this project. Within the framework of the GRACE project, the main idea, as the title of it said, is continuity and rupture. So the question was, what happens after 1918 when the Habsburg monarchy collapses, and then you have a series of successor states in its place? Are there any artistic continuities, or is it sort of all done away with and new ideas start? And within that framework, I was particularly interested in rural and regional cultures because, of course, the national revival movements at the beginning of the 20th century are something that much has been written about, and that has played a very important role in the art history of Central Europe more broadly. But Austria, to me, it seemed, took a kind of particular position within that, because even though a lot of the modernist ideas that were formulated at this time were very strongly rural, when we talk about Central European modernism more broadly, by which I mostly talk about the kind of core Habsburg successor states, Austria often is not entirely connected to those narratives. Even though, of course, especially in the last decades, there has been a lot of really amazing research on the role of Vienna, that Vienna after 1918 was not a kind of wasteland as it has often been presented as before, but a very rich cultural scene. What I was interested in is what happens outside Vienna, because of course, as we all know, after 1918, you had Vienna as the capital, as a cosmopolitan capital, but then a lot of the other part of Austria was rural. And the question was, how does this impact the visual culture of the day? And how can we form an argument looking at Austria on the one hand, but then also looking at Austria within a broader Central European perspective, to move beyond national narratives, which is still a kind of very strong framework in which art histories of Central Europe are being approached, to move beyond it and think about how the idea of rural cultures might help us to move beyond that. And that was kind of the main idea of the book. And within that, that sort of brought as a necessity with it to move. Well, the book title is Art, very broadly, like modern Austrian art. But I quickly realized that I was actually more interested in the broader circulation. So really what the book is about is not just painting. Actually, there's no sculpture at all, I think. But then a lot of it is sort of what we might classify as visual culture. And magazines, illustrated magazines particularly, play a very important role. And also the question how we might think about the rural differently, because I imagine, now I've said the word rural many, many times, and you all probably have a certain idea of what that might encompass in relation to Austria. And one of the key things was, on the one hand, to look closely at how this played out in the 1920s and 30s, but also how we might find counter-examples. And the image that I have here by Anna Lesnay is one of the examples in which we might challenge the idea of the rural as a kind of very strongly focused Alpine modernism that I think is most closely related to Austria at the time, but also I guess today still, so there's a longer relevance to that. But Anna Lesnay, she was a Jewish-Hungarian artist who was very active around 1900 in Hungary and in an area that later became a part of Czechoslovakia, but before that was a part of Hungary. And this complicated explanation in itself already shows that when we talk about the rural, it's a little bit difficult to talk about different places, because they, of course, changed countries, they changed populations, and often the rural as borderlands were not very homogeneous spaces. And this is exactly what the example of Lesnay here shows. And actually, when Lesnay made this painting, she was in Vienna. So we can also talk about a kind of rural modernism. This is a watercolor that was made in Vienna by someone who very closely engaged with the idea of a rural ideal. She had a very strong sense of utopia of the countryside as a place where many different peoples could live in harmony. And this is how she visualized it. But of course, it's very different to what we might think about as a kind of Alpine modernism. So this is one of the key questions to begin with. But what I want to do is I organize the book by chronologically, but also thematically, in the way they feed into each other. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the main arguments of each chapter, which I hope will set us up for the conversation, to then talk about the kind of contradictions that are in it, and that I hope will make for productive discussion, rather than sort of trying to make everything neatly. The key idea really was to complicate the ideas and to have those contradictions very strongly present. So to start off with, the first chapter, Dreams of Autonomy, starts around 1918, and it moves to a space that, of course, we might not necessarily see as the rural, because we talk about Salzburg. Salzburg, of course, rose to great prominence through the Salzburg Festival, and there was also a very rich visual culture that went around with it, and with that also came this sort of rhetoric of artists moving away from Vienna and trying to rejuvenate the Austrian art scene by locating it in a place that was seen to be sort of Catholic, German, and much more rural than a cosmopolitan Vienna that didn't necessarily match the idea of post-Habsburg Austria anymore. What I'm starting with here is the artist exhibitions of Der Wassermann, an artist association. And the key thing about Der Wassermann really was that even though this rhetoric was very strong of we found a new Austrian art, we tried to ground it in a place that is more rural or that is at least surrounded by an alpine landscape, actually the visual language didn't change as much. So this is one key aspect of it, that it was more the idea of physically being away from Vienna that was the key, rather than really changing its visual language. And even though it very quickly turned out that the Salzburg art scene was, to a large part, a lot more conservative, and artists such as Erika Giovanna Klein, who also went to Salzburg, suffered a great deal from being there and felt that this was a very restrictive environment in many ways. Actually, not being in Vienna also opened many possibilities for artists, especially women artists, because when we talk about the Wassermann, there were many ordinary members. The steering committee was led by 5 people, but 2 of them were women. So actually it also shows that the kind of structures that you had in the artistic organization often opened up many more possibilities by moving outside and sort of trying to start anew. The second image that you have here is a collaboration by Kajetan Mühlmann and Boldi Wojtek, who you might be familiar with because there was a research project not so long ago talking about Boldi Wojtek's logo design for the Salzburg Festival, which in an altered version is still used today, but which really also focuses on the fact that actually even though Wojtek was someone who was trained in Vienna and actually attended art classes with many progressive women artists, she herself was definitely not one of them. And she, together with Kajetan Mühlmann, who was very strongly involved in National Socialism, had a very successful career that went much beyond the 1930s. And the case study about her is really that she started to apply a kind of modernist idiom that she had taken from Vienna, but the way she applied it was in ideologically a lot more conservative. The reason why she is part of the chapter is also to sort of think about how our narratives of Austrian modernism might change if we look at the country more broadly. And to be honest, this chapter was quite difficult in a way to write, because in my own idea, it was that I tried to prove sort of that you can also find sort of very progressive movements outside Vienna. And when I started with Salzburg, it sort of showed that, well, definitely not to the extent that I had hoped, but I think exactly for that, it is also important to have that as a part of it. But anyways, the sort of baseline and the subtitle says this, that regionalism, by which here I refer to very literally as a move away from Vienna to Salzburg, but then, and I will get to in the next slide, to other locations as well, that it was really seen as an opportunity to start something new and to sort of find a new visual idiom as well that reflected the new geopolitical context of Austria after 1918. And it was precisely this also that later on, so now we're moving towards more let's say, official channels, which is exhibitions. How there was a trajectory of artists that sort of reinforced a very strong regionalism, but that regionalism didn't just stay local, but it moved up the ranks, if you will, and it became very, very visible in Austria's international representation as well. Now, the key things about this are that on the one hand, I don't know if I can call it a movement, but one development that I address in this chapter very strongly is Tyrol modernism, as a place that already before 1918 had a very, very strong rhetoric against Vienna, and that set it up to very convincingly develop a kind of regional idiom that was very strongly building on landscape, so place is a very important part, but then also on the rural peasantry in a very idealized way, to show that sort of certain aspects of modernist painting, for example, were already there in Tyrol modernism because you had the kind of flat mountain landscapes, you had the bright blue sky, you had those very heavy farmer figures that were popularized by figures such as Albin Egger-Lienz. So I'm looking at some exhibitions, I think it's 4 altogether in this chapter, and I'm starting with this Tiroler Künstler, Tyrolean artists exhibition that traveled in Germany. It was shown in Switzerland. It was also shown at the Secession in Vienna, as well as in Budapest. And by the time that it reached international audiences, it was already framed as a national representation of Austrian art. And that sort of then was adapted because there were certain artists, architects, cultural figures that had very strong connections to Tyrol. The key figure is Clemens Holzmeister, for example, who then became very important in organizing those international exhibitions. So in a way, there is a trajectory of how you had the development of a kind of local idiom that then moved up to becoming a national representation. And the sort of peak of that, I also talk about the Austrian exhibition in London in 1934, but the sort of peak of that then would be the Austrian pavilion at the Paris World's Fair in 1937, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with this image, which has this sort of very fantastic, massive photo montage by Robert Haas as the sort of center point, and the way here the Austrian landscape is really the key of it, but the way that it is shown is not in a kind of conservative visual language, let's say, but is framed very, very strongly within a modernist idiom. And that is really the key, that through those exhibitions, a visual language was developed that sort of tried to convince local as well as international audiences that the countryside in a way could be modern, and the way it was modern was often through facilities such as technology. And the reason for that was, of course, tourism. So we cannot really talk about rural regional modernism in Austria if we don't talk about tourism, because this is really where a lot of the visual imagery was constructed, and also some quite exciting examples. I always try to show this. This is an advertisement from Die Bühne, and I wish that it would exist somewhere so I could smell what Alpenheu actually smells like. But you can also see how the box was sort of designed to have, like, there's some Tyrolean dancing figures and the landscape, and then you have the little hat on the perfume bottle. So this is a kind of extreme example of how this rural modernism became really fashionable. Because this is also a key aspect of this chapter in particular, where, especially when we talk about Tyrolean modernism, to some extent also the Salzburg variant, was that it was quite strongly male-dominated. But through tourism and through this idea of the countryside actually being a fashionable place, that allowed for a much bigger range of representations. And you had several young, very fashionable women artists who were trained at the Academy of Applied Arts, who engaged with this as largely as a part of holiday making. So they reflected on their own experiences. The Salzkammergut plays a very important role in that, for example. And they constructed a much more playful idea of what the countryside could be. And going in hand with that, and this is where I move outside visual culture very strongly, is also the idea of fashion. So the Dirndl fashion that is not, that is actually produced and very strongly advertised, again in illustrated magazines, by young fashionable women. So rather than, I think that nowadays we might think about it as a sort of very conservative thing, but this is really where it is fashion, and it embodies a kind of a rural modernity that is really also represented by its wearers as very progressive young women. And this is also where the book more broadly moves more strongly into the realm of popular culture, and also in a way beyond this official representation that is very strong still in the exhibitions, of course. But that also allows for a bigger variety. Now, of course, another thing that we cannot leave out when we talk about regional and rural visualizations of Austria is Heimatfotografie. The interesting thing about Heimatfotografie is that, as the name already says, I think that in English there is no real sort of elegant translation for it, and partly due to that, but also due to the fact that it became a sort of very strong instrument also then under the Austro-Fascist regime, under the National Socialist regime. It is often very strongly tied to Austrian and German culture. But actually, this sort of conservatism that goes in hand with the idea of Heimatfotografie also needs to be nuanced. On the one hand, because the kind of star figure in that sense is Rudolf Koppitz, of course, who, because he had also engaged in dance and performance photography, he had, of course, trained with Madame Dorat in Vienna. So the kind of very highly stylized imagery that he produced and that he became very well known for, also like in the Land und Leute exhibition, for example, in 36, 37, was actually not this idea of going outside to the countryside and producing a sort of Heimat imagery that is really trying to depict everything as naturally as possible, but it was very, very strongly constructed by someone who knew exactly how to work this visual language in a way that played with ideas of modernist photography, but then set it very closely in a rural setting. So this is one part of it. But then the other part, and this is why you have this page of, I think this is the children's special actually, and one thing that I noticed this morning is what's particularly nice is that you have like the vision to the future with the person from the year 2000, and then on top, this is what I actually talk about, you have some Slovak shepherd boys that play with camera equipment by Karol Blitzka. So this is where I try to bring in the kind of regionalism that also had a strong perception in Austria that was not Austrian, but that really had engagement with other places of the former Habsburg Empire. And the connection here we can make very strongly with Karol Blitzka and Koppitz. Actually, Blitzka was also present in Vienna. He showed his film, The Earth Sings, which is, this is a still from the production. He showed his film at the Orania in Vienna, and through his connection to Leopold Wolfgang Rochowanski, had quite a strong presence. And one of the ways that he was received as a photographer in Vienna was very, very similar to the way that Koppitz was received, as someone who knows the country, who goes there, who knows how to speak with the people in this sort of very idealist way. But also what comes through to that is that this idea of depicting the homeland, and I'm keeping this vague on purpose because this is also very much how it was presented. This idea of the homeland was the sort of the urban trained rational man who goes to the countryside and he knows exactly what to do, how to speak to the people. That was one side of it. The other side of it was the sort of aim to encourage amateur photographers to take also Heimat pictures. I think this is something, and I'll also get to that in the next slide, that is best known in relation to the leftist press in particular, but actually it was a much broader movement, this sort of amateur photography movement. Der Weltguck, which was an illustrated newspaper that was very close to the Christian Social Party, published in Innsbruck, had many, many calls, for example, of encouraging people to take pictures of the beautiful countryside. What also comes through there is that actually the people that were spoken to were still urban. So they were, again, mostly holiday makers or people who went on weekend trips and that experimented with photography and were encouraged to sort of show their view of how the Austrian countryside is very beautiful. And the key aspect that also feeds in here is this idea of where are actually the rural people. Because, I mean, you can see them on the picture very clearly, but the way that they are approached and the way that they feature a lot in regional rural modernism is very much as sort of models and ideas of a past time. There's very little engagement with them. There's very little of taking them seriously. And I think just to sort of come back to Blitzker for a while, because he also published a tourist book for German speakers going to Slovakia, which was called Columbus in der Slowakei. And in this very title of having Columbus going to the countryside, you can already see sort of the idea about it. So the people in the countryside were very strongly exoticized, and you could go to them and you would have to explain to them that the camera actually does not steal your soul. This is not an exaggeration. This is what actually the newspapers report, that you have to speak to the people carefully. You cannot laugh at them if they come with some superstitious things. So there was a very strong power imbalance between those who took the photographs and those who were actually on it. Through that, also this idea of Heimat photography is a very masculine thing. So it's very much this idea of the artist explorer, and you can find very, very few women actually who are present in that as well. But sort of not to just leave it at Heimat photography, one thing which actually stems from the fact that I'm quite interested in social photography in the countryside. I was quite curious, and I had some very helpful conversations where I was very surprised that you had a kind of social photography in former Czechoslovakia, you had it in Hungary, but I didn't find any movement of that sort in Austria. This is sort of the best I could get to, which is the Kuckuck, of course, and they had some features on sort of rural poverty as well. But then the issue that very quickly emerged when looking at those images more closely was the problem with trying to, the problem at the time, to define a kind of amateur photography that was socially conscious, let's call it, because on the one hand you had, of course, the Naturfreunde Association, which very strongly encouraged amateur photography, but the sort of photography that they encouraged was very touristic in a way as well. So it was more about bringing the workers and exploring the outdoors, let's say, but it was not really about images of rural poverty as such. And so there was this constant tension about trying to encourage people to take a socially conscious view on rural poverty as well. But the problem was how to depict this without falling into the idealizing idiom that was so strong through Heimat photography. That was really the key issue. Actually, what most of the images show is that one very successful way, or not very successful, but one more successful way of doing this was actually through series, because you could tell a story by employing sort of new means of photography that would, for example, move beyond the single image. And then also sort of images like this, but again, as soon as they became very strongly stylized, they played more with this idea of a modernist idiom that did not necessarily lend itself to showing the social hardship that was the case. And so this is the sort of conclusion in a way that I came to, that even though there was some awareness on the part of the Social Democrats as well as the communists, that people in the countryside also had to be encouraged to be part of the political battles that were taking place at the time, it was very difficult to actually capture this. And in a way, because Heimatfotografie was so strong, it only had some mediocre success in terms of really including them into a visuality that moves beyond this kind of this kind of idealization. And actually here now in Einer von Millionen we are in Styria, but there is one Bundesland that actually had a very different visuality to it in the interwar years, and this is where I conclude, which in a way I think is more of an idea and needs to be fleshed out much more fully, and that is the idea of the countryside as a rural exotic, but a rural exotic not in terms of speaking about kind of idealized peasants that were seen to be sort of framed in the past, but and I apologize for these sort of quite offensive images, but the rural exotic was also seen, and especially in relation to the Burgenland, as a place of difference, and in that what becomes extremely strong is this idea of Roma communities and the way that they were presented. And on the one hand you have this tension again, where in painting it was sort of looking back at the sort of Hungarian leftover, because of course the Burgenland became part of Austria later on, but that it was sort of seen as this idealized place in which often Roma communities were used as a way of presenting this particular region as very, very different to the Alpine safe West. What you can also see, of course, this image, I think there is no precise date for that. It's by Hans Lavin, who actually started to make his name around 1900. He was part of a conservative group of painters, but he remained very, very successful in the 1920s and 30s, and he eventually died in the 1930s, and immediately after he had a special feature which already was published after the Anschluss, where he was celebrated, and he was celebrated as a so-called gypsy painter. So this was really sort of his idea to give a kind of nostalgic twist to a highly exoticized image, and this is how the Burgenland on the one hand is presented, but then also the representation of Roma communities themselves also very closely aligned with what is happening in other countries at the time. And there is always this connection between the countryside and the periphery, together with sort of very, very strong stereotypes that circulate really. They often start in Czechoslovakia, where you have much larger Roma communities living, but then they are quickly transferred, and there is this constant tension in a way between those sort of very exoticizing and also often, especially when it comes to women, eroticized images, and then also those sort of quasi-documentary photographs that have a very uncomfortable ethnographic angle to them as well. And this is something where, again, Austrian visual culture at the time and this idea of the rural exotic actually fits in very nicely with other narratives that are happening in Central Europe more broadly. And I think I should slowly tie up. So this is the penultimate slide, which I wanted to choose simply because having all this variety of images from different outlets as well, I think visualizes very nicely how complex in a way this idea of the rural is. And that in a way all of this falls in, and we might be much more familiar with certain narratives such as the Winter in Österreich poster, or maybe the Heimat photographs, but there were so many different nuances, and some sort of reached an official level, whereas others operated in a much more popular way. And this is also why, like, this is a comment that Robert Haas wrote in a letter to his brother, and I think it's a sort of perfect way of describing how rural modernism in Austria actually was constructed at the time, that it is sort of neither that nor that, and everything is picked and chosen, and that somehow makes a whole. And that sort of, brought it to the point the best for me. And I think I will finish at that, and I hope I have shown plenty of material to talk about. Thank you.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much, Julia. Would you like to start with questions, or shall I ask one?
I've prepared actually 3 questions, and 2 of them you already answered. So
sorry.
Well, but I have one more general question about the terminology and the methodological approach related to the term modernism, because as I read your introduction, it becomes very clear that you critically engage with Central European modernism that deals only with urban centers, and against that you pose also the idea of a horizontal art history where the rural is included but is interconnected with different sorts of regions. That is very clear for me, and that's why you come in, where the regional modernism and the rural modernism, and you said also alpine modernism as a term, comes into play, to play against or direct against like a sentimental, nostalgic idea of the vernacular, as I read in your book as well. However, I wanted to know more about. Or if you could talk a little bit more, if you also try to entangle, or would you entangle modernism from modernization or processes of modernization and modernity, and how, because I wondered sometimes what modernism actually means, and is it a formal language? You said modernist idiom that then comes into play and gets transformed or gets replicated, but in a more conservative way. And then you also showed us this wonderful picture of the pavilion where modernist technologies, or so to say, I wouldn't say it when I talk with TJ Clark, I would say it's a modern technology, processes of technologization that were used for a certain kind of iconography that is against a modernist language somehow, or yes or no. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you for the hard question. So I always find modernism, because of course there's so many different definitions of it, and actually one of the reasons why I changed the book title is I didn't want to have modernist, but it should be modern. And modern in the sense of, on the one hand, we speak about a specific time, of course, but then also modern in that sense includes those processes of industrialization and also, in a way, urbanization, whereas modernism, I would connect more within this broader sort of narrative of art history in Central Europe at the time to also specific movements. And I think that a lot of the things, a lot of the material that I looked at does not very comfortably fit into that. And this is also why I sort of, I had a big issue actually finding a good terminology for that as well, because also, of course, regional modernism is already occupied in a way, and there are some really, really great books on regional modernism as well. I suppose the most important one would be Eric Storm's, which is actually called Regional Modernism, I think, that focuses on how specific regions are then used by artists as a kind of, he calls it a third culture, so moving beyond the kind of conservatism of art academies, and then you have the avant-garde that is challenging that, and then the regional modernism, sorry, not the rural one, the regional modernism would be a kind of third culture that on the one hand is challenging the establishment, but is a great deal more popular. And I think a bit of it falls into that, but then I was also, I didn't want to sort of just adopt this term because I wanted to have the bigger nuance. Maybe if I talk about the pavilion, I think that one key thing that actually I didn't mention was also, especially in the exhibition Austria in London, one really key thing was that actually Vienna didn't disappear, of course, in those narratives. But one thing that became very visible in the Austrian London exhibition is that this idea of modernity, of progress, was linked through tourism to the countryside. So you had the latest hotels, you could fly there, you could go by car, or you could take. So there was sort of all these. Let's call it the amenities of a modern life that would allow you to reach the countryside easily. So there was this sort of tension, but by locating that there, in those sort of more conservative representations, then Vienna can be shrouded as a nostalgic Habsburg capital. And so the interesting thing is that in this narrative, it's not actually the separation between the countryside and technological progress, put very broadly, but actually they become one to allow then for the city to exist in a different space that is still important, but more for its nostalgic value in a way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Like us, you work with gaps in historiography a lot, and unlike us, you speak Czech, which is, as you already mentioned, you didn't mention that it's helpful language-wise, but you mentioned that a lot of the Roma population in these areas you spoke about actually lived in Czech Republic, and I was wondering when reading your last chapter how if during your research on this creation of the Roma stereotype, if you came across works by Romani artists that challenge these stereotypes, or if it's really hard to find something like that.
I've been working on the one hand the representation of Roma communities, but also Romani artists. In a different context, and actually this was one of the first questions that I had, but at this point in time actually it's very difficult. You do have, it also depends on different media, so in Czechoslovakia, for example, you have literature by Romani artists, by Romani writers, that gains bigger reception in the mid to late 1940s, for example. But at this particular point in time, I mean, also because often the reception is, of course, in a very abstract ideal, and there is, so Czechoslovakia is one place, the other one is Hungary, and in Hungary, actually, there is a photo collection, and this is something that is quite important to consider as well, that actually the way that Roma were stereotyped in either of the ways that I have shown, is of course also people who were forced to live in settlements that were often outside villages, so really quite literally at the periphery of peripheral towns already. But this was of course not all of the population, and there were of course Roma families as well that lived in cities and that were very well assimilated. And there is a whole photo collection of sort of Roma families going to studios and have choose the way that they want to be depicted. So I think you have it in terms of self-representation, but in terms of artists, mostly later. Simply also because, the first Roman emancipation movements did start at around this time, and the Soviet Union was particularly strong in that. Partially adopted also in Czechoslovakia, it didn't really reach Austria, but also because the Roma population in Austria was quite marginal, but it was very strongly connected to Hungary as well as to migrant workers, actually. So there was this rhetoric of migrant workers come from Czechoslovakia and they are all Roma. But these emancipation processes were more like in newspaper publishing, in gaining legal representation through Romani lawyers and so on.
Thank you. I think we're opening the space to questions from you guys. Are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting, and I'm just trying to. I would just like to ask you to maybe explore a little more, or connect a few things a few points that you've definitely already made and or at least hinted at. And this question is how actually city and or urban and rural scapes intersect with each other, or you hinted at that when you said that the Roma community was located in urban peripheries, and this is probably true for many of the the metropolises were so much, they were becoming bigger because people from the countryside were moving into the cities, and so there's definitely that aspect, but also an aspect of how the audiences for many of these images were definitely urban. So maybe something like that, but also another aspect or another layer here that would interest me would be the difference between the different countryscapes constructed in these images, which you've also already hinted at, but that's just really definitely something I would be interested in. The Alpine region as opposed to, you hinted at Burgenland, but there's also other regions maybe that you've explored in how they also were constructed in a kind of as oppositions maybe, or in opposition.
Thank you so much. This is a really great and very rich question. I should have taken some notes. But of course, yeah, absolutely. So there is no way to ignore the city. The city is always present. So on the one hand, the imagery circulates through the city. Many of the images that were created were made by artists who had connections. I mean, I suppose that Alfons Walde is one of the examples who, of course, he was also trained in Vienna, but he made this very conscious choice of moving to Kitzbühel and then staying there. But even there, he had very strong connections to the Viennese elites. So there's no way to get beyond that. In terms of kind of a diverse population, I think that I don't have the image by Lesnai there. Of course, the cities are the main points of migration, and this also means that this is where you have the most diverse populations. But actually what Lesnai's work shows very explicitly, and this is where I think I need to bring in the help of this Hungarian artist, because I have not really come across an artist who identifies himself as Austrian or herself as Austrian at the time, who would show something similar, because what Lesnai does is she also shows that many rural places were maybe not as diverse, but they also were. So especially the Eastern Slovakia that she really focuses on, there were large Orthodox Jewish communities. There were many Roma settlements as well. Then there was generally, there were Czech officers that were sent in. There was a local sort of Slovak-speaking population, and then there were Ruthenians from the part that was in Ukraine. So I think that also the borderlands actually were not as homogeneous as many of the narratives tried to make out. But of course, this also, I think there's those different levels of representation of the countryside, and this Alpine modernism is the one that becomes the strongest. From what I have found is like really the places that feature the most is Tyrol on the one hand, because I think there was also this political opposition. And then also Salzburg, because of course it had very strong cultural capital through the Salzburg Festival. Which is not to say that they had no connections to Vienna, because of course in a way that was also limited to the summertime in a way, in this very strong visibility. And then the Salzkammergut, but I think the Salzkammergut is very particular because in a way it was reinvented to some extent. I think like it became more through things like the Zinkenbacher Malerkolonie, for example, where you had artists spending the summer there. It became a sort of updated, fashionable place that was quite different to what it was maybe around 1900, but of course it had this continuity going on. And then the Burgenland, but also I suppose Lower Austria, when we talk about Marienthal, for example, those places featured very differently, and I think that often the thing is that those discourses didn't necessarily overlap, or they took place in different circles. So often they didn't really match, but all of them went through the city and Vienna as the metropolis specifically. Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent there was a political instrumentalization, because in many of the photographs you show it was a kind of heroization, both from the socialist and from the nationalist perspective. And also, of course, the 1937 Austrian pavilion is a classical demonstration of the Austrofascist, and you have also the socialist interest in the sewer, for example, for Millet, very simple, it's like European image rather than a local image. So what extent the political instrumentalization, especially in the media?
Thank you for the great question. Of course, and I think that one very important publication is, of course, Come from die Stadt, from the Wien and the exhibition from the Wien Museum from 2017. And I think there, this sort of politicization of the rural already became very strong, and especially in 1937, where you also had, I guess, this contrast of showing an Austro-fascist Austria that tried to make itself different from Germany, from National Socialist Germany, because of course we are still at the time of the 1000-Mark-Sperre as well, where Austria had to sort of expand its tourist markets. So there was a strong politicization of that, also to the point where, the one, I think this is probably quite a well-known case study as well, that Robert Haas, of course, as a Jewish photographer, so he designed the collage. The images were from the official Lichtbildstelle of the Austro-fascist regime, but he actually never made it, I think, to Paris. And even though the pavilion won a prize, he did not win it. So there was a sort of undercurrent anti-Semitism that was there, but that was not so strongly outwardly pronounced within this idea that Austria was sort of different than Germany. But generally, I think that those instances are ones where the instrumentalization sort of comes to a heat, but they started to develop much earlier. I think and this is one of the things that I was interested in, that it does not start in sort of 1933. It starts a lot earlier, and I think it moves exactly from a kind of local, often also very reactionary and conservative, but not only, sort of local emancipation movements.
Definitely leftist politics as well.
And leftist.
The Kuckuck,
Yeah, with the Kuckuck, I mean, the issue was also voters, of course. I mean, this is the...
And they're anonymous, they remain anonymous. I mean, and very heroic, the narrative story that you show us.
But also very unsuccessful. And I think one of the reasons why they were not so successful is also because there is I think it was the Jugend, so not in the Kuckuck, but in the Jugend there was a call for the socialist youth from Vienna to go to the countryside and encourage sort of the country bumpkins, in a very terrible translation, to join the Socialist Party. But the way that they were written about was extremely simplified. So I think that even on the side of the left, there was a huge stereotyping of the rural population, and I can imagine that was not particularly helpful in making them support their cause. Yeah.
I have another question, which is spontaneously made, but I wanted to pick up the question on the differentiation within different depictions of alterity, because I wondered, you mentioned, for example, the exoticization of Slovak rural population in, for example, the magazine, or was it a newspaper that you showed, where
I think it was Die Bühne.
It was Die Bühne, where the children are looking at the...
No, that was a daily, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned that there is an exoticization going on, but then if you compare it to the depiction of Roma population, I had the feeling there's more devaluation going on, and I wonder how you would also find that in the visual representations, not only in the textual verbalizations on population that are exoticized in different ways, I would say. Because you also mentioned that with Roma women, that there are gender devaluations going on as well. So maybe you have some more ideas on this.
I think that sort of rural farmer populations more broadly, I guess this could also include sort of Tyrolean farmers actually, the way that they were, if we want to call it exoticized broadly, is in a very idealized way within this idea that sort of time stands still in the countryside, nothing is changing, there are those eternal circles. So it was a stereotyping and in a way a temporal exoticizing. But what comes in with the representation of Roma women especially is of course also the question of class, in the sense that Roma were almost without exception shown as like part of the Lumpenproletariat idea, declassed. And when it comes to Roma women specifically, this is something that I sort of have started to trace, but not in too much detail. But there is this great book by Nancy Wingfield on prostitution in the late Habsburg Empire. And she talks about Galicia, and she talks a lot about sort of anti-Semitic stereotypes, and also the role of Jewish women and this exoticization in relation to Galicia. But there were also big Roma communities there. And in terms of the visual representation, it sounds very strange, but it is really, really hard to find a painting of a Roma woman without seeing her breasts at this time. And that counts for both artists who sort of capitalize on this eroticization, such as Lavin, but actually there's also a painting by Friedel Dicker-Brandeis, for example, which shows in a way, so it's a mother who's feeding her child, and the depiction is slightly more sympathetic, but in terms of the visual stereotypes that are used, they're exactly the same. So, yeah.
maybe this is really just a follow-up, a comment, because we were actually struggling for terms when Eva was thinking about her own research, whether this could be described as a type of specifically Viennese primitivism, basically taking the place of what was happening in other metropolises in such as Paris, etc. Of course, at the same time, where you really have as a placeholder different types of figures, but in a very similar type of typecasting, etc., and stereotyping. I mean, of course, so far it's easy to think about Orientalism, about othering, about exoticizing, etc., but primitivism still has this other very strong impulse, this kind of dynamic that is really important to modernism. And I was wondering whether you would go as far at all, or remain a bit more cautious about something like that. Basically, the question would be: is this a drive? Is this really a real drive would you say, in a very generalized way, that this is a drive in Austrian modernism, in Austrian conservative modernism,
You mean in relation to Roma representation more specifically?
Yes, as you described it right now, not necessarily reduced to that.
I think, well, in a way it builds on a much longer legacy in terms of the sort of booster paintings also of someone like August von Pettenkoven. So there is a local element to that too. And I think when we talk about this idea of speaking in a broader European framework of modernism, there are exceptions, I guess, but when we look at painting, I think there was less experimentation. I think it's more like design and a kind of younger generation, especially of women artists actually, who were much more experimental, but not necessarily in relation to the rural, but I think also in terms of the rural, because you have people like Liesl Weil, who I'm a big fan of, who is of course not someone who exclusively focuses on the idea of constructing a rural image, but for her it's very much part of this idea of local cosmopolitanism. As someone who's also interested in music, of course she would go to Salzburg in the summer, of course she would visit the Salzkammergut and then build an imagery on that. But I think it exists more in the sphere of maybe popular visual culture as well as design.
Yeah, my question goes a little bit in the same direction that you are mentioning now, because you told now for example, in the presentation of the Roma people, that there is not so strong difference between men artists and women artists. But at the beginning, you were mentioning the fact of the woman protagonism in this artistic panorama, both in the more recognized arts and more popular arts. And I would like for you to develop a little bit more, if it is possible, to trace some kind of difference. In some way you were already mentioning now, and how this is also connected to the broader panorama of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. If it is a trend that emerge also in other countries, and if there are connections, or if it is something very peculiar in this perspective of the gender protagonism of women in the way that they were protagonists in the construction of these images.
I mean, of course, you have like very significant social and political changes in 1918, which support the fact that more women gain access to an artistic education, that more women follow that. So I think it's also this specific moment in time where women in a way become more visible, probably are still not visible enough. I mean, there is a lot of amazing research being done, but I think that there are still many invisible women in that. But in terms of if they develop their own idiom, I don't know. I think this is
women taking conflict, everyone has the empathy that they show. And the paintings that were much more sexualized, that were avoided in photography.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was definitely a gender issue.
Yeah, but I think I wouldn't want to essentialize it. That is the thing. But yeah, of course, and I mean, also one important thing is that women had access to different spaces. I think on that level is also important, especially when we talk about also rural photography, and but also I guess in a way in design and in the way that this is visible in popular visual culture. Like one really nice thing, if you, I don't know if you ever have started reading Die Bühne, but if you do, you can never stop. And it's really amazing because then they have all those features of young women artists, and they visit a sort of fashion school, and there are so many young women contributors to that, like as photographers, as illustrators, as journalists. So there is definitely a kind of a growth in that, but then I think I get very excited when I think about that. But then I also think about Baldi Wojtek, and so I think that women definitely became more present, but it's also important to have a kind of differentiation in how and who they were engaged in. And I think that often in art history, not just in art history, in any kind of research, we like to follow what we believe in and what we want to support. But I think often there is a counterexample to that. And I think this was also a kind of key thing that I wanted to do with the book, to have sort of chapters that speak to each other and that say, well, you can look at it from that side, but just as much you can also look at it from the other. And this counts for the involvement and the development of a visual language by women artists, as much as for how the countryside more broadly was employed by different forces. Yeah.
I have a bit of a complicated question. I mean, throughout the beginning of the 20th century at the MAC, the Museum of Austrian, there was a huge exhibition of Austria-Hungary in which the Tyrol sent their crafts, and there were women and men, both together, or Salzburg, or from Slovakia, from different regions. And they were represented by these products as representing their identity. Now we are coming, this was until 1914, so 1912, 1913 was one of the last. Now we come for 1918, 1919, and it seems to me, using the phrase of my colleague Lisa Silverman about the Jews becoming Austrians, that there was a lot of process of suppression of core culture, that it happened also with the regionals, with the periphery, that there was a lot of process through tourism, selling Austria. There was a lot of, that's why we don't see specific landscape of specific place that would identify it immediately with this region. This is one of the questions that was raised. So there is a process of becoming Austria also of the periphery here, no?
Very strongly, yeah, absolutely. I think also there is one of my favorite books for the tourism chapters was John Urie's The Tourist, which I guess like is a classic. But he says that tourism was such a strong force in creating those identities, especially Austrian identities, because it forced you to simplify in that way. And then through this whole performativity, I guess that sort of crystallized certain aspects that were very successful.
But this is a rupture from what happened within the Austro-Hungary, and this idea challenge, bring your work into Vienna and show your products from Tyrol, from wherever there was. And it's very, I mean, there were different products for sure, embroidery, toys, children toys, etc. But they were also their own production. It was their own production coming.
Yeah, but I think that, I mean, this is where I guess the Habsburg Empire was a kind of more advantageous space for difference within the frame of the empire itself. Whereas, of course, within the nation state, this had to be, in a way, eradicated. Even though I wonder if Austria might have been a little bit different if I compare it to Czechoslovakia, for example, because the Bundesländer had quite strong autonomy when it came to like tourist policies, agrarian policies, and that allowed them to develop in some places like very strong industries. Whereas if I look at Czechoslovakia, and I'm sure that Marta will talk a lot more about this because she knows all about it, but in Slovakia, in a way, of course, in Czechoslovakia, of course, you had very strong companies in that as well, but there was a much bigger difference, and I'm saying this because Czechoslovakia, in a way, is seen to be like the mini Habsburg Empire after 1918, where you have sort of, this is what the Czechs do, this is what the Slovaks do, this is what the Ruthenians do, this is what the Germans in the borderland do, which of course is also a simplification because of the different populations that live there, but maybe that is still more similar to before 1918 or 1914. Yeah.
One very simple question. Do you know which collection this image of the nursing mother is now in? Because I think you showed the source, an online source, but do you happen to know which collection?
Actually, it's a weird story. I don't know if there's more versions of it, but so what happened to Lavin? Lavin, he was in Austria, then he became a war painter in Galicia, and in 1921 he decided to move to the US, and he moved to Chicago, where he founded Hans Lavin's School of Painting, and he took several of his paintings with him, and this one features in a sales catalog, and apparently it was sold to a private person. The painting changes its titles throughout, and it was sold as the Galician Gypsy Mother. That was the title at the time. And the really interesting thing also about Lavin is that when he's in this very conservative group of Chicago artists, and he starts making portraits of American Indian populations. And so there is this, and there's this connection. But he doesn't stay in the US for very long. He then comes back, and he also illustrates Wiener Lieder very successfully. So he's building on this nostalgia very strongly, and he's known to be this, sort of happy, popular painter. And also there were also people who specifically requested Roma paintings. Yeah.
I think that concludes the evening, the story. If you haven't done so yet, and if you're interested in purchasing Julia's book.
One very important thing is, it's of course, the book is very expensive with Routledge, but it's open access too. So you can just download it as a PDF. But there is also a discount code if you want to have 20%. The hard copy.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.